This is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the SpeechCast, a joint venture of the JILV and the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal. I'm delighted to have with us today Jonathan Kay, who is an editor at Quillette magazine. He's also a columnist for the National Post in Canada. He's a book author and editor. His newest book, coming in October, is Magic in the Dark, film exhibition. It's about film exhibition in New York City. It's one family's century of adventures in the movie business. And it's co-authored by Charles B. Moss Jr. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later in the podcast. But Jonathan, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here. Sorry, I just had an audio glitch, but you should be able to hear me now.
I hear you perfectly. Glad you're with us. So, Jonathan, I've followed you probably much longer than you followed me. I've been very interested by Quillette from its beginnings. I think it's in the 5th anniversary, right? You're marking the 5th anniversary?
Yeah. It started, I guess, a little bit more than 5 years ago, and I came on board after it was around already for 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. But yeah, although I tell people 5 or 6 years is like kind of middle-aged in this niche. For a website like ours to be around for 5 or 6 years is a long time. Yeah,
I remember how unique it was when it first came out, and I thought to myself, I don't remember exactly when it sort of pierced my consciousness, but I remember saying, finally, somebody's writing about some of these issues that were plaguing me and yet felt like they had no public expression. So I don't know. I'm sure there were other places where these ideas were being brought out, but I hadn't seen them for a very long time. So it's such an important publication. How did you get involved in Quota? What about your personal ideology and worldview that brought you to Quota?
Well, it was very much, as you just described, I don't think there was anything like it. I am somebody who worked at a conservative newspaper in Canada called the National Post, and I became kind of, I don't know, disaffected is the right word. I liked the newspaper, but I don't consider myself really a conservative. And like a lot of the stuff they were doing on, say, global warming, skepticism, I found myself at odds with it. And then I went to this ultra progressive magazine in Canada because I was offered the editor-in-chief job. Seemed prestigious and came with good money. And after just 2 years, that I realized that wasn't for me because I was also alienated by all these dogmas on the left. And I think they didn't find my presence helpful because I was skeptical of a lot of stuff that they kind of accepted as cant. And when I quit that job, at that time, I didn't think I really was going to stay in journalism. I had a fairly lucrative job as a ghostwriter. I still do that. I actually love ghostwriting. I was writing books. I was thinking of getting into podcasting. I'm sort of fortunate in my financial situation because of the way the vicissitudes of the housing market here in Toronto. And so I thought, I was 50 years old. I thought, well, maybe, I've had a good 20-year run in journalism. I'll do something else. And then I saw Quillette and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have to reconsider that, because it was a website that critiqued conservatives where they had to be critiqued, and it critiqued progressives. I think it's more known for critiquing progressives because it's more controversial. But that's only because I think it's more controversial to critique progressives, and in the current climate, to critique even the mildest critique of progressive ideology, sometimes just people blow it up as a kind of hate speech. But it reawakened my love of journalism because I had a home where I didn't have to apologize for being skeptical of both sides.
Right. So would you describe yourself as an ideological middle of the roader, or do you sort of lean in one direction?
So I think it's a cliche to rely on the left-right spectrum. Mm-hmm. It's also become a cliche to say that it is a cliche to rely on the left-right spectrum.
Right.
Like it's become a sort of meta cliche. But I do think in the current environment, it's sometimes more helpful to look at methodology in the sense of if you're on the left or the right and you are looking for heresies, if in almost a religious sense, if you're saying, aha, you don't agree that trans women are exactly the same as biological women, or you don't love Donald Trump, if you're a Republican conservative and you critique Donald Trump and you're sort of cast out of conservative circles because of that. To me, that's that method, that quasi-religious method of hunting for heresies, of excommunicating people because of what is perceived as a single ideological sin. That is the thing that I'm most concerned about on both sides of the spectrum. And it's the subject of a lot of my writing, but I'm not even sure that counts as ideological per se.
Right.
It's more like a methodological.
It's epistemological in some ways.
I don't use the E word because
no one knows what it means.
Well, also people turn off the podcast when they hear words like that. Right. So, I mean, look, people turn off podcasts when they hear my voice in general. But I would say I have a voice made for print, as I say. But I think it's the same critique. I was just down in Tennessee for a week, and it's interesting that I was hanging out with some good friends in Tennessee. They happen to be conservatives, but a lot of the conservative ideas they were saying, the very conservative part of the United States, obviously, like I felt the same ideological lights in my brain kind of lighting up in opposition to what they were saying, much as if I'm on progressive Twitter and I heard progressive talking points that I found. And again, I look, ideologically, the short answer is I guess I see myself as a classical liberal. I believe in due process and free speech and all that stuff. In the way liberalism was defined maybe 5 or 10 years ago, before it got hijacked by people who are just completely obsessed with identity politics. But I don't focus on that so much in the current environment. I focus more on the methodology of argumentation and trying to reclaim a more rational and objective way of looking at the world.
Yeah. So what did anything happen in your life where you canceled? Were you affected by the current ideological environment in a way that sent you to the Quillette Hills? I mean, how did that happen? Have you since become canceled or rendered, problematic?
I can't claim. I mean, these days people kind of, it's almost like you bragging about being canceled. It's
right.
But I don't think I could make that claim. I think when I kind of made my definitive break from progressive circles, this is shortly before I joined Quillette. This is going back to 2017. I mostly did it on my own terms. So I can't claim to have been canceled. And I had been in the business long enough that I had plenty of connections. I was able to keep writing columns for my old newspaper. I wrote for, one of the first things I did when I quit that job is I wrote for half a dozen different prestigious American magazines, just because I wanted to sort of get my name associated with other media outlets and make a clean break from that. And then I also just jumped into a bunch of book projects. But I think there is certainly no way I could go back to this sort of like progressive Canadian literary subculture. In that little silo, I'm definitely, I don't know if cancel is the right word, but there's no way, it's like the Canadian equivalent of Harper's Magazine is not going to come calling for me to write features for them. But I did experience enough of it to be able to edit the work of people who truly have been canceled. So I think it was important to get like a small taste of what it is for people in a particular subculture to just completely try to demonize you because of your ideas, and then trying to extrapolate from that. Imagine if like that was your whole life. Like imagine if you're a poet and you didn't do ghostwriting, you didn't have a day job, and all you did was write poetry and edit poetry, and maybe like you had a contract position at a local community college to teach poetry, and somebody in the poetry world said, you're never having anything to do with poetry again. We're never going to publish your poetry. that's true cancellation, because
Right.
that's like you're in a silo and you're out of the silo and there's nothing else for you. Like there's the only other thing for you is flipping burgers at Burger King, or I don't know, trying to go back to school and become a locksmith or something. Like that's true cancellation. I've never experienced that, but I kind of have experienced the demonization or the attempt at demonization that gives me a taste, like 1% of what those people are experiencing. And in a sense, it was a blessing, because then, I've edited dozens and dozens of pieces by people who truly were canceled. And I was able to deal with them with at least some kind of empathy or understanding, because I understand what they were up against. So yeah, it ended up being kind of good for my career, though at the time it was annoying. But since then, I've kind of made it my new. I mean, it's sort of like the New York Times. At one point, there's a quote from me recently, but I describe myself as an ideological ambulance chaser. Like when people get canceled, they come to me and I help them tell their stories.
Right.
But I wouldn't have been able to do that if some of these Canadian literary types hadn't tried to come after me.
So can you give me an example or two of people you've helped write for Quillette that you feel really express the current ideological problem, really are examples of cancellation? Did anything stand out in your mind, I guess?
I think the purest example, and the reason I keep coming back to poetry, is because it's, especially here in Canada, but I think it's true in the United States, is like there's a small number of gatekeepers. They're either philanthropists or publishers. And this tends to be true of all industries where people get canceled, is like a very small number of gatekeepers can decide if you're canceled. And there's a guy by the name of Joseph Massey, Massey. Like most, I mean, he's a successful poet. Like most successful poets, he's not a household name, even the very successful ones, because it's a niche art. But he was very successful. He got canceled a few years ago. Just anybody who wants to know the details can Google Joseph Massey and Quillette. And his story was really like within the space of maybe 24 hours, 48 hours of some bogus allegations being made on social media. I guess this is going back about 3 years. I think about 3 years ago. This is kind of when you could still do that and there wasn't instant pushback, because now there's sort of like, there are people who become very skeptical of it and there's a whole machinery of pushback. But at the time there wasn't. And his whole career ended, bang. He had a teaching gig at a very prestigious university. He had a book contract coming up. It all, like, not over weeks or months, but it was like the call went out in the industry through social media, because social media is now sort of used as by ideological enforcers to keep people online. If you are on the side of light and goodness and all that is the right in the world, you will help us end the career of this person. And if you don't do that, it means you're on the side of Darth Vader. And that was it. And it's like, it's an unusually crystal clear example of it. What's
he doing now? Is he still writing poetry?
He's still writing poetry. He's written his story. He's been on podcasts, and he has found a way to keep going because there are publishers and there are philanthropists in the United States who have come to realize that talented people are being unfairly excommunicated. But it's marked him as being, like, it's defined him as being a kind of anti-poet, if you will, like in the same way that Barry Weiss at the New York Times has she's become, I mean, I think she has more readers now than maybe she did before because her Substack is so popular. Right. But in a way, she will always be known as the kind of anti-New York Times writer, because it was such a defining breach when she left and she started up her Substack. And even if 90% of the stuff she publishes on her Substack is stuff that maybe, could appear in the New York Times, or in a year or two could appear in the New York Times after the social panic is over, it will still define her. And in the case of Joseph Massey, he could publish 10 more books of poetry, he will still be marked as the sort of in this anti-poet tribe of poets. And that's a defining thing. And for a lot of people, I've, as many articles as I've published by canceled people, I have sat on a lot of articles by canceled people which never went to press. There's a Canadian woman who has an incredible story to tell about getting canceled in Canadian arts and letters. I edited the thing and I was about to hit the publish button, and I could tell she was hesitant. I said to her, are you ready for this? Like, this is sort of your defining manifesto where you break from everyone who's been your friend and colleague for the last couple of years. And basically this is your j'accuse. Are you ready for that? And she emailed me back and said, you know what, I'm not ready, because once you do that, you can never, the tribe will never accept you back. I mean, I argue that you'll never get accepted back anyway, but this is like 100%.
Right. It's interesting because I probably would have done the exact same thing. And I've had some conversations with people. I'm not a magazine editor, but about coming out or being on my podcast, for example, which could be a kiss of death for somebody who's not, who's in a certain kind of position in the Jewish world. There was a piece yesterday in Barry's Substack by Abigail Schreier, who wrote the recent book on girls becoming trans, and has been a controversial figure, and the book's been banned, as you know, I think at Target for a while. I don't know if it's been reinstated. It was for a while and then taken off again in Amazon and so forth. And she wrote a piece about how, the first 100 or so emails that she received from admirers said, I commend you for your courage, but I can't do that because I would ruin my life. And at some point she said, now it's time for courage. I mean, and I feel this tension in myself where I want to tell people, I understand I was in a job where I couldn't have come out and expressed my authentic views, but at some point, some of us have to actually come out and take some risks. And maybe we should stop telling people that they shouldn't have to, because they're going to damage their life, because otherwise liberalism is never going to come back in full force. What do you think of that line of argumentation?
So it's fine, and I agree with it. Here's the problem: is thanks to social media, not just social media, but other forces in our society, there is a very close intermingling of professional and social circles. So I'd say 20 years ago, before social media, you could segment your professional and personal life. So you could be somebody, I don't know, like a famous author or a public figure or an activist who did a lot of controversial stuff professionally, but then in their neighborhood, maybe people wouldn't even know that this was a famous person, or to the extent they knew he was famous, it was just somebody who walked the dog and came over for, Tupperware parties or whatever. Like, it was just, but thanks to social media, that's now impossible, because if you're on Twitter or Facebook, your editor might be in your channels, and your next door neighbor may jump in on a chat, and the guy you went to college with, and your college age children might. So there's this intermingling.
Right.
And your friend, when you decide, okay, I'm going to do this controversial thing, or maybe something that shouldn't be controversial, but in the current climate is, it isn't maybe just certain segments of your professional circle that you're alienating. You're also maybe creating a breach with high school friends, because
Right.
Big phenomenon now is people graduate from college and they don't make friends in their community because their friendships are sort of stuck in amber in their social media circles. And those are the people, even 10 or 20 years later, those are the people whose opinions they care about, the people they went to Brandeis with, even though they might live in St. Louis or Moscow or something on the other side of the world. The people they care with, whose opinion they care about, are people they haven't seen in a decade, and people from the same social circles, and who also have white collar jobs, and it has a kind of tribalizing effect. What the analogy I use for people is the Hasidic community in Judaism. Actually, when I was at this magazine, one of the pieces I was very proud of, there was a piece by an author, I think his name was Jeffrey Rosen, who still lives in Montreal, and he lived in a sort of Hasidic sandwich. He lived in a triplex he had a Hasidic family on top and a Hasidic family below him. It's a part of Montreal known as Outremont, and it's a segment of happens to be an extremely Jewish and extremely Hasidic part of Outremont. This guy is like me. He's largely secularized and he doesn't keep a kosher home and so forth. But he was genuinely curious about the Hasidic community, and he became friends with a few of them. And at one point, like there was one guy, I don't know if he was gay but like he was clearly, he didn't belong in that community for a variety of reasons. And Jeffrey Rosen asked him, like, why are you still there? Like, why don't you just say, hey, see you later, folks. I'm gonna go move to New York or go to college and I'll do it. And the guy told me, he said, like, really? Like, I love my family. I love my friends. There are parts of this community I like. You want me as on principle, on a point of principle, to reject all of the people I love and start a new life, like at the age of 30? Like, how many people would do that? And
right.
The reason this guy faced that decision is because the Hasidic way of life is a totalizing way of life, in the sense that the people
it's
you
all
do
or
business,
nothing. Yeah.
the people you do business with are often the people you go to the same synagogue with, and they might even be cousins. And like there is no, well, there might be in some cases. I don't want to generalize, but generally speaking, there's a lot of overlap between professional and social lives. Ironically, in their bid to recapture, I don't know what 18th century shtetl life from Poland, that dynamic that Hasidic community is trying to recreate, that dynamic has an odd similitude with 21st century social media culture, in which you got the same overlap between your professional and social circles. And when you get excommunicated from one, it can mean being excommunicated from the other.
Yeah. So you're in Canada, you live in Toronto, correct?
I live in Toronto, yeah.
So how would you characterize the situation in Canada versus the United States, the ideological environment?
So the problem with Canada is that I'm not even sure, I don't want to use the word problem, but in the United States, you have this counterweight on the conservative side, which is called Christianity. You have a substantial portion, it's a shrinking portion, but it's still a very substantial portion of the population that subscribes to, they're evangelical Christians. They could be, evangelical has become a sort of somewhat ambiguous term, but depending on self-identification, but they're regular churchgoers. They have socially conservative views. And so you have this built-in constituency that for good or ill, and I have my views on that, are never going to get sucked into progressive ideological manias. They get sucked into their own ideological manias, like in some cases, sort of anti-vaccine stuff and global warming denialism and the Trump cult. But they are a built-in opposition party to progressive manias. In Canada, the conservative Christian constituency is fairly marked. It's not non-existent. I mean, I live in Ontario. There are parts of rural Ontario where there's a lot of them. Toronto, there isn't. And if you look at the big urban districts in Canada, and even most big suburban districts in Canada, or ridings as they're known here, it's not a big deal. So what happens is when the educated class gets swept up in a progressive ideological mania, there's no pushback. I mean, there's some pushback, but it's a heavily stigmatized and heavily, there is a party in Canada called the Conservative Party, but on most issues, anything touching with identity, if they deviate at all from progressive orthodoxy, there's a whole media apparatus waiting to slam them as American-style racists. And so in some cases, they toe the line more than the Liberal Party does, because they know that people are ready to pounce. And they don't have any kind of built-in conservative constituency. In the United States,
what you're saying is it's worse in Canada than it is in the United States.
I would say it's worse if you define the problem as a lack of ability to dissent from some pretty radical progressive ideological manias, but America is worse in the sense that you have a more extreme form of polarization. Like Canada is becoming an ideologically monopolar society, which is bad. America is becoming more of a you have two poles, but the poles are going further and further apart. Like when I look at my conservative American friends' Facebook pages, it's still full of all this stuff about like voter fraud and ivermectin, like sort of vaccine stuff, and and I'm like, oh my god, this is so off-putting. But then you go to the progressive pages, and it's like biological sex is a myth, and and then you're like, well, or like critical race theory stuff, pro Antifa stuff. So you have both poles there. Now you could say, well, at least you have a balance, but that balance doesn't express itself in a centrist way. Right. So neither society really is on a sustainable, stable path toward any kind of centrist politics. But you have two different problems, I would argue. Right. The problem is Canada seems bent on inheriting a lot of America's problems. Like the American obsession with race just wasn't a thing in Canada until fairly recently. I mean, obviously races and racism are problems in every society. But thanks to social media, like Canada, we had a march against police brutality in Canada, in Toronto, after George Floyd, where people were saying, like, the Toronto police force is just as bad as the Minneapolis police force. And then you look at the numbers and it's like, well, actually, we have on a per capita basis 1/20th the amount of police brutality claims and tragic incidents. But that didn't mean anything. These marchers in Toronto were fired up with the idea that our society is every bit as racist, every bit as violent as urban societies in the United States. 99% of those people have never been to Minneapolis and know nothing about it, but they're just convinced that through the alchemy of racism, they are as guilty as everyone in the United States. And so we've inherited the American. I was just in Lebanon, Tennessee, and I did a COVID test because I needed to come back to Canada. And the only thing I had to put on the form was my name, my birthday, and my race. In a million years, Canadian medical establishment, like the idea that I would have to put my skin color on a form, like a medical form like that. They've started to do it a little bit, but this is an American thing, this obsession with skin color. Canada has started to do this, and it's really disturbing, and it's because of social media. But I'm wondering, is that because they're trying to link health outcomes to race? I mean, we've seen that discourse in the United States, those assertions that health disparities are a function of racial discrimination, and they're looking for evidence of that by asking race during the COVID test. I'm sure that's why they're asking it, right? Presumably, and in fact, you can pretty much go look at any metric in the United States and you will get a racial breakdown. Like, so, this data that Americans take for granted about, how many blacks voted for the Democrats, how many blacks voted for the Republicans, or, during the primaries, there was all this detailed data about your skin color and who were you, which candidate you supported. That information has never existed in Canada in any kind. I mean, I'm sure there's some kind of informal data, but it's most, even to this day, it's mostly anecdotal. Interesting. Yeah, and European intellectuals are starting to complain about the same stuff. Like you have French sociologists who said, like, this critical race theory stuff, basically it's French postmodernism that Americans turned into a racial obsession and then exported back to the rest of the world. Right. So, I mean, your cultural imperialism knows no bounds. Right. Yeah, we're good at it. So when you look at the US and you see these two opposite poles, do you see the same thing on both sides? And by that, I mean, when you talk about what's happening on the left, I can point to a very specific ideological framework. I call it critical social justice ideology, but, that has sort of taken hold in the left.
And yet I'm not sure I could say the same about the right. Obviously, there's irrationality that's taken root. Do you think it's the same, or do you think we're seeing different things on both sides of the ideological spectrum?
I think conservatives are still looking for a coherent ideology to replace some of the certainties that Christian religiosity and unfettered capitalism once supplied. But I definitely think conservatives are more in flux in terms of what they believe. I can't speak as much to the United States, but here in Canada, I've argued that the Conservative Party should change its name, because to the extent conservatism has any fixed meaning, there is no conservative movement really in Canada.
Right.
There's no politically mainstream anti-abortion movement. There's no real politically mainstream movement for capital punishment. We live in a welfare state. Even the Conservative Party here in Canada supports the welfare state. So I certainly think conservatives are more in flux in terms of what are the things we believe. Whereas progressives, even if you hate what they argue for, they at least have the certainty of, like, these are our dogmas. And often in a battle of ideas, it's the side that can write down their ideas in a more concrete form that win, because they at least can articulate their demands.
So there's a lot of talk about how this might end, or whether or not there's going to be sufficient pushback from people, both, I guess, on the right and on the center left, or from the classical liberal humanist wing, to eventually sort of carve out a place for liberalism again and put back critical social justice ideology in its place. And yet, I'm not so sure that's going to happen. I don't know about your degree of confidence. Maybe you'll talk about that. It seems to me that there's trends going in both directions. You cited the fact that there's now a mob going in the opposite direction. So whenever someone's canceled, there's a group of people who come out on social media and stand up for them. So I think that's sort of a welcome sign. Maybe it's got its negative implications as well. And there's a new field emerging. My group, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is one such organization among many. We're forming something called the Institute for Liberal Values, which is a consortium of groups that are fighting the good fight. So that's all happening. Yet it seems to me this is also generational, and you have a younger generation, Gen Z, maybe some millennials, who have really bought into this ideology, and that may not go away just because they enter the workforce and become CEOs or get elected to office. What's your feeling on where this is all going?
So the problem is that liberalism, classical liberalism, has no dependable or passionate constituency, in the sense that if you are progressive, sorry, I shouldn't use the term progressive. If you are a classical liberal, and again, I probably use that term to describe myself, you're defending free speech. And what does defending free speech mean? It means defending speech, to the extent that protection is meaningful, it means defending speech that's obnoxious, or that you disagree with. If you're defending due process, that often means defending criminals. If you're defending freedom of faith and conscience, that often means defending religions, including radicalized forms of those religions in some cases, or, head coverings, the hijab, the niqab. A lot of people, have sort of a reflexive hostility to that. So to be a liberal, there's a built-in drawback to liberalism, which is you're always defending substance, views and actions that you may disagree with, but you say, on principle, we have to tolerate that. That becomes more difficult in the face of any kind of social panic or mania or hysteria or strongly felt reaction to things. And those things in turn tend to be driven, what are they driven by? They're driven by video. They're driven by Twitter mobs. They're driven by, we are now so saturated. It's one thing to say, you know what, I tolerate views I disagree with, such as hate speech. Or stuff that's presented as hate speech. It's another thing when you click on the YouTube video and you see the face of the guy. Oh man, look at that guy. He's spouting that crap. I want that guy to shut up. I don't care about free speech. We need to shut that guy. We need to delete his account. We need to find where he works and fire him. You may not have that reaction if you didn't see, if his YouTube video weren't one click away. In the same way, if you were conservative, maybe you wouldn't be as agitated against Islam if you weren't one click away from, say, videos of terrorist attacks or, stuff going on in Afghanistan or Iraq, places you'll never visit, half a world away, but someone puts a video of some horrible thing happening there, and suddenly it's immediate, and you become radicalized against a faith community, in your town, because you see someone with a hijab or something, and you kind of connect it with stuff going on the other side of the world. That's a social media thing. And I would argue that social media pushes people away from liberalism because you're always seeing the worst of the world. You're always seeing the worst of your enemies, and you're seeing it in a format, video, which is highly emotive. The enemy of liberalism is reflexive, emotional responses to stuff. And you saying, I don't care what we need to do. We need to stop that. We need to shut that person up. We need to punish those people. And I don't care about what my principles were 10 minutes ago. I want it done now.
Right.
That's
so,
yeah.
So Jonathan Rausch, and he just came out with his book, Constitution Knowledge, is actually more optimistic than most of us are on this, because he feels that eventually social media will become like, print media over time and start to patrol itself, and that he sees signs of sort of an intermediation taking place in social media that will eventually police itself and prevent the worst of social media from infecting society. Do you share that optimism?
No, no, because you have to follow the money. When you had a 3-channel universe, and I mean, I'm in my early 50s. I'm old enough to remember when I think there were only 5 or 6 channels we got.
Channel 4, 6, 10, and 13 was PBS.
Yeah, so
in Columbus, Ohio, that is.
So in Montreal, it was 3 was CBS, 5 was NBC, 17 was ABC, 11 was CTV, and 13 was CBC. This is
right.
I could live to 200, and I will remember those numbers. Yeah. But sorry, Zoe. Sorry, my dog's here, and I let her in.
I got a dog too.
All right, so the barking you hear is not from me, although I do get agitated. So in those days, every one of those stations had to cater to a broad audience, and to the extent they were catering to a broad audience, it means they had to shear off the ideological ends of the bell curve, and it meant that there was no offensive conservative stuff by the standards of the day, and there was no offensive progressive stuff by the standards of the day, and they were catering to what was perceived to be middle America or middle Canada, or everything was pretty bland. I mean, you look at the TV shows of the day, it's wow, they were crap. They were crap because no one could take risks. Now that we have on-demand video, people can take risks with shows, and if you don't like it, you don't watch it. But there was newspapers. Montreal had 1 or 2 newspapers. Well, French language is 3 or 4. To create a newspaper was a big deal. It was a lot of capital costs, a lot of investment. Every city had a few. To start a website or streaming services, stuff like that, it's much more of an a la carte situation. And social media is the ultimate a la carte situation. There are millions of Twitter accounts, and you follow the 117 that you like. And the economic necessity of tailoring your content to a centrist constituency, which was built into the economic model of print media, of mass broadcast in the 3-channel universe, that's gone. And in fact, it's centrifugal. The content that's the most attractive to people on social media is the stuff that's not right in the middle. It's the stuff that's on the wings. You're either watching it because you're watching Rachel Maddow because you agree with her, or because you hate Rachel Maddow. You're either circulating Tucker Carlson videos because you agree with that, or because you're a progressive and saying, look what this crazy person is saying, and some of the stuff he says is crazy. But either way, I don't in my feed, I don't get a lot of people saying, hey, check out what this guy in BBC World is saying about the upcoming election in Zambia. You know, there's two good candidates. This guy discusses their policy. Like, that's like gets 3 hits. Like,
Right.
no one cares. No one cares. BBC World has, World Service, tons of good content. A lot of it just doesn't get circulated because it doesn't create outrage or stoke tribal instincts on either side. I'm still a print New York Times subscriber, and I love reading the New York Times. I love the obituaries because it's some of the best, and by the way, I've been reading obituaries since I was 30 years old. There's some people in their 80s, they read obituaries because their friends are in them, but I love stuff that's not, I love the ideological stuff. I love the non-ideological stuff. The New York Times still has a lot of great content once they keep away from, what 23-year-olds are putting on their Slack channels. But that's the stuff that I tweet from the New York Times, like, hey, check out this great obituary of this football player. Like 5 people will retweet that.
Right.
But
by the way, Roush argues back that the very fact that the New York Times has a lot of great content still, it shows you that it's not completely captured. I think he resists this metaphor of institutional capture that a lot of people are using, including myself sometimes. That because what he's saying is, yeah, that's true. The way that they may look at everything through a racial equity lens and the way that they write stories on race, but there's still a lot of stories that are just excellent journalism that you see in the Times that have nothing to do with race. And it seems like you're affirming that.
I am affirming it, but there's also a cycle of distrust. Like, what's, again, going back to some of these conservative voices in my peer group, I sometimes I circulate, again, I'll go with the obituary example, and to the extent people comment, it's like, yeah, New York Times, I don't know, like,
right.
And I'm like, well, read the article. It has nothing to do with ideology. It's just like, and by the way, some of these obituaries were written like 10 years ago because they have canned obituaries. And there are cases where obituaries are written by people, the authors of the obituaries are themselves dead because they wrote it and they passed away. But people still don't trust it because of the brand. And I'll give you another example. This has nothing to do with New York Times, but a friend of mine did a YouTube video. It was a podcast much like this one. And he and his friend were talking about anti-vax conspiracy theories. And the people who ran the YouTube channel are not anti-vax conspiracy theorists. They were kind of debunking some of this anti-vax conspiracism. But because they played audio from an anti-vax conspiracy theorist, YouTube flagged it and banned their YouTube video. And so, for them, it's exasperating, but it's also the fact that now, if I'm ever talking to an anti-vax conspiracy theorist, they will cite the fact that YouTube is removing content that supports their position. They'll say, "Oh, you really need to watch this video. It proves I'm right." And they'll say, "But you can't watch it because YouTube took it down, and so you'll never know this truth." And how do you debate against that? And that incredible distrust, unfortunately, that distrust is leaching into all media. And so you have people who, if they look at the New York Times and they look at 2 or 3 articles, especially like in the Sunday review section, which becomes this like garbage can of just woke essays and stuff like that. I don't even read it anymore. But to the extent I read it, it does poison my appreciation of a lot of this, like 99% of the material, which isn't ideological. Or look at this incredible science writer. His name is
Don McNeil.
Yeah. And he basically, it's like, I need you around whenever I have a name on the tip of my tongue and I can't remember it. But he went to Peru, of all places, basically on this money-making New York Times junket for spoiled upper-class white families, and said the wrong thing in front of some teenager who kind of reported him for thought crime, and he was gone. And this is a guy, when you talk about like non-ideological, high-quality New York Times journalism, this guy, I mean, he is like Exhibit A.
Right.
So much so that even after he got canned, the New York Times was hyping him to awards committees
for his journalism. So that he get right. Exactly.
I mean, just the ultimate hypocrisy. But like, my question then becomes, who replaces him? Like, who is his replacement? Somebody like him, or is his replacement somebody who's like, you know, in the interview process, they're like, well, we had a problem with the last guy. So where do you stand on colonialism and critical race theory? Like, even, well, maybe not even, but maybe especially now in the domain of science, the people who walk in the door to replace some of these old schoolers, they're bringing stuff into the newsroom which might militate against good objective journalism. So I do not share Jonathan Rauch's optimism.
If you had written a piece for Quillette or were involved in the writing of a piece for Quillette and it went viral, and you got a call from Tucker Carlson to come on his show, would you take it?
I wouldn't do Tucker Carlson. I've done Fox a few times to promote books, but I'll give you an example. So I had so I was on Fox a couple of months ago because I was involved in this crazy thing. I tweeted a joke about I won't get into it. Actually, there's some people listening that probably know this. I tweeted a joke about how I'd used my dog. I have dog shampoo because I have a dog, which you've heard my dog barking before.
Right.
And
Zoe.
Yeah, Zoe. Oh, okay. Zoe. So, and I use dog shampoo, and I tweeted like this self-deprecating joke about how I didn't know the difference. And it was this really happened. I think
surreal. I remember this now. Go ahead.
Yeah. And Seth Rogen, who was like at the time on some crazy Twitter bender and getting to arguments with people who are a lot more famous than me. And he jumped, he just called me an idiot. And the whole thing went viral. And actually it worked out. I got like 2,000 new followers. But also like all these people, I mean, even to this day, I'll sometimes get these trolls who are like, oh, what do you know? You use dog shampoo. But at the time, a Fox host called me up and said, hey, do you want to come on and talk about this? And this was a guy who I knew he'd once written for my newspaper. I knew the guy. And I said yes, because he was a guy I knew, because we used to work together at the National Post. And, but then during the interview, it was like, I was kind of defending Seth Rogen because I said, yeah, you know, I was really alarmed by this because I love Seth Rogen's movies. And I do. I think he's a really like Bad Neighbor. Bad Neighbor is an amazing, super funny movie. But this host was like cutting me off. It's like, no. Seth's like a member of the liberal elite and he's this and he's that. I was like, I didn't sign up for this. Like, I don't want to, you know, Seth's originally from Montreal, my hometown. Like, he's a Jewish guy and he's going through some crisis and whatever. Like, but I thought it was funny that I had 5 minutes of fame over dog shampoo, but all the host wanted to do was like do this Ann Coulter rant about how Hollywood liberals are bad people. Which, you know, I like if you or I moved to Hollywood and became famous, we'd probably become douchebags too. Like, it goes with the culture. So it's not a particularly interesting phenomenon to discuss. But unfortunately, like, to me, that sort of ruined the interview. Is just that it's just like scoring points for tribalism, right?
Mm-hmm. So speaking of movies, you're writing a book on movies. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. Sorry, this is the part in the Johnny Carson interview where it's like, oh yeah, I'm really excited about the next film. I think you have a clip of it, and you show the clip. But
I don't have a clip of your book. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. But it's called Magic in the Dark: One Family Century of Adventures in the movie business. And it was just this incredible experience. It's this family. The last name is Moss, M-O-S-S. And the guy, he's actually my co-author and my main source, Charles B. Moss Jr. He's the third generation leader, and his son is the fourth, of this film business. It's been in the Moss family for, you know, since basically the creation of film. So Charles Moss's grandfather was one of this first generation of Jews who moved to the United States from Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and created the film business kind of out of nothing. And they have this incredible family archive that I was able to work from their Times Square offices. They have this incredible office right at the very heart of the Times Square. They still own the building, and I just go through the whole history of film, which is just absolutely fascinating stories. People always ask, do I have a chapter on porn theaters? Yes, I do. Because it actually was a somewhat sad chapter in film, where a lot of these gorgeous film palaces in the 70s and 80s, unfortunately got turned, they turned into low rent.
Yeah, I was just in Times Square this last weekend. I mean, I slept in Times Square last night, not the night before last, and I remember, and maybe still in the early '90s, I think, going to New York City on the train and being struck by just like every single place in that area was just all porn. And then now fast forward it, whatever, how many years, and it might be Disney, it looks completely different, but I don't think a lot of people know how different New York was like at that time.
Well, New York, it's gone through at least two major cycles of, call it, decadence and revival, because in the mid 20th century, there was overreach, but there was a puritanical sweep against, burlesque houses and all these old-fashioned terms. And I mean, a lot of it was driven by homophobia. There's a great play called The Nance, which was about homophobia in the enforcement of entertainment laws. But then it happened again in the late 20th century, because if you went to Times Square, like in the 80s and early 90s, I mean, it was bad. Like, there was a lot of crime, a lot of porn. And unfortunately, like, I have no problem with people in general, with people selling porn. It's but unfortunately what happens is it tends to go hand in hand with sex trade. And like, there's a lot of, money laundering. There's a lot of bad stuff that goes with it. And so then these laws were passed that I think it was like only 20 or 30% of your inventory could consist of XXX stuff. So you get these weird situations where these people, like 30% would be a porn store and the other part would be, I don't know, they'd be selling hardware, whatever it was, or they'd be selling books that weren't porn that, no one was buying. And it became uneconomical and they all sold out. And then the big thing was when The Lion King came in and Disney invested heavily. I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was the old Amsterdam theater.
Right.
And that transformed it. And then,
you don't think that wasn't Giuliani instituting new laws that made it so they'd have to all go out of business?
So, well, I mean, yeah, and the legacy there is politically mixed, because conservatives like Giuliani's law and order agenda, but it was also very dirigist from an economic and zoning perspective, where they were saying, we got to clean up the filth, and it ended up being a hyper-capitalist thing where, like, now, middle class, upper middle class families roll in and spend thousands of dollars on sort of Disneyfied entertainment. Well, this is pre-COVID. I mean, COVID has destroyed some of these businesses, although I think they'll come back. I was in New York on my way to Tennessee, and I already saw signs of extensive revival just in the last few months. But yeah, it's basically was effectively a huge rezoning thing. And now, and Times Square, like, it was interesting, in the mid 20th century, it was a glamour destination. You would get dressed up, and we have this section in the book. Charles Moss was, he lived out in Long Island, but he would come in, he put on like his little bar mitzvah suit to go see a movie. He went to a lot of film openings. There's all these pictures of him as a little kid with Marilyn Monroe and stuff. It was actually quite incredible. But like, you dress up to go to dinner and a show could mean a movie. And then it hit rock bottom. And then it revived, but it revived in this kind of like mass market family way. Whereas before it was kind of like more of a Frank Sinatra scene with like sort of martinis and kids would, eventually the kids would go away, and, there was dance clubs and stuff like that. And the film business was just at the heart of all this stuff. So yeah, it was wonderful to research this and learn a lot about New York. I spent a lot of great trips in New York City, visiting architectural destinations, and a lot of it has to do with immigration, because a lot of the film business, it popped up in southern parts of Manhattan, which were basically where the schmutta business was, because a lot of the people who got into the film business were people who were in the clothing business, the Jewish immigrants, and they saw their margins were getting destroyed because every immigrant, there was all these skilled tailors coming in from Europe, not just Jews, but and so, a good tailor will come in, and they were making peanuts because the market was flooded. And they said, like, what's another all cash business that we can make money in and that isn't flooded? And they basically started throwing bed sheets up against the wall and showing movies. And that was, and that's how it happened.
Wow. That's great. Well, I look forward to learning more in the book, and maybe once it's out in October, we'll bring you back again to talk about it. So, this is a Jewish podcast, and I want to ask you a little bit about your Jewishness. I think on your Twitter profile it says you're a lapsed Jew. Talk a little, but I've talked to you, not just on this podcast, but since, and you're clearly somebody who's been at some point immersed in Jewish life, and you know a lot about it. So what role does being Jewish play in your life and your worldview?
So the reason I put lapsed Jew in my Twitter profile is to basically protect Gentiles from embarrassment when they, occasionally one of these social justice enthusiasts will come in and say, as a WASP, you know nothing about hate, you know nothing about this and that. And
I see.
And I'd be in this like, and sometimes it wasn't me, but it was one of my followers would say, you idiot, like, here's an essay he wrote about, Judaism. So part of it is just to give fair warning to these social justice fanatics who see the name Kay and assume that I came over on the Mayflower, or the Canadian equivalent of the Mayflower.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to Jewish school for the first, I guess, 5 years of my schooling. What really hurt my connection to Judaism was I've always been horrible at second languages, and we did a lot of Hebrew instruction, like 3-4 hours a day of Hebrew, and I could never learn it properly. And I grew up in Quebec and never learned French properly. In college, I spent 4 years trying to learn Japanese, never learned that properly. I did 3 years of Latin in high school. But like second languages was always like super painful for me. Mm-hmm. And so I came to associate with Judaism with like really frustrating failed attempts to learn Hebrew. Mm-hmm. and feeling like an idiot, and like a real idiot. Like I had one teacher who was like kind of made me feel pretty dumb, because my Hebrew really was bad. And I was good at all these other stuff. I was good at English, and I had a flair for math and science and stuff. But and so Judaism, I kind of came to associate as the thing that made me feel stupid about myself. And I couldn't, I'd go to synagogue, and I went to synagogue on Saturdays until I was like, I guess 13, until my bar mitzvah. And it was like I didn't understand anything, and it felt boring. I felt dumb. So that was the thing that kind of alienated me from Judaism. But my mother in particular did a very good job of sort of emphasizing like the intellectual aspects of Judaism. And she introduced me to Spinoza, and there was and more, of course, much more modern, Mordecai Richler. Actually, Mordecai Richler's son Jacob was in my class in high school, and I read a lot of his books, and learned about immigrant Jewish life in Canada.
Right, those are great books. Yeah,
and like, I don't know, the Saul Bellow, and it is describing Jewish life in Chicago and stuff, and that on top of that, there's also like the mass market infusion of like everything from Seinfeld to, I'm not even sure if Seinfeld and that stuff, or Mel Brooks even counts as Jewish humor anymore. It's American humor.
Right.
But it had a particular resonance for me, because like when Seinfeld would talk about Del Boca Vista, like we went to Del Boca Vista every year. My grandparents had a place in Bell Harbor, and the social interaction among the cabana, the well-tanned cabana denizen at their condo was like, it was Jack Klompus. Like it was exactly like life in Seinfeld. So
I went to Bell Harbor every year, by the way.
Okay.
Surfside, actually. Surfside, Bell Harbor, every year during winter break.
Yeah, well, Surfside isn't really Bell Harbor, David.
I know. But if it's walking distance.
So Surfside is where we would walk to get our coffee and go to the pharmacy. Then we'd walk back to Bell Harbor. So I have this story, because if you were at Surfside, you were across the street from, you remember the Neiman Marcus that was across the street in the mall? Yeah, so those are the Bell Harbor
Bell
shops.
Harbor Mob. Yeah, those were a lot of fancy people in the Bell Harbor Mob.
Well, it got fancier as the years passed. But I remember every day I would stand with my grandmother, waiting for the valet to bring her Buick Skylark, so she could drive across the street and park it and we'd have, grilled cheese sandwiches and then drive back across the street. And that was life there. But again, that whole life, I mean, I'm not describing anything religious. I'm describing something cultural. Everyone in the building, not everyone, but a lot of people in the building were Jewish. So that whole thing is kind of part of who I am as a Jew. It's a very cultural thing. Unfortunately, again, I'm not religious.
Did you go to the Rascal House, by the way?
No. What's the Rascal House?
The Wolfie Cohen's Rascal House, which was a restaurant. It was a few miles north of Bow Harbor area, but it was the restaurant that you'd see like Jackie Mason would frequent anyway.
Up near. Okay, so yeah. Well, the only reason we would go north there is to go see the Highlight.
Right, that's right.
If you went to Dania, you could see Highlight, and my grandfather liked to bet, so gambling was a thing.
Yeah, that's great. So, have you been to Israel?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the thing is, when I was at the National Post, especially, this is the Canadian newspaper where I worked at, I wrote about Israel all the time. And I would go every couple of years, I would go there on like journalistically. I had friends who were there. I'd sometimes go on social trips. I went all over the place. I spent a week's, Yad Vashem had a study course for journalists on the Holocaust, and I did Yad Vashem. I did a driving trip all the way up north. At one point I went down to Eilat. I would go to Israel a lot, and I would write about it, but I would write about it in a geopolitical way. And I wasn't writing about it in any kind of spiritual way. And at the time, like, it's difficult to remember now, but I remember in particular 2002, 2003. This is like when the Second Intifada was in full force. Israel was like a leading issue in what we would call the culture wars. You remember, like, British newspapers were publishing like these really horrifying cartoons of Ariel Sharon eating babies and stuff. It was like really dark stuff. Now it's interesting. Now, I mean, you still see a shadow of that. Progressives still have this kind of like sort of instinctive thing. It's like, oh yeah, we should say bad stuff about Israel. That's kind of like part of our shtick. But it's like but it's not like their heart isn't into it in the way it really was 20 years ago. And even conservatives, I think, I remember many conservative columnists. It was common to write that, like, as goes Israel, so goes all of Western civilization, and it was seen as a proxy issue for the war on terror, for moral absolutism versus moral relativism. It was seen as, the Palestinian cause was seen as a sort of displaced form of Marxism, oppressed versus oppressor. And there is still some of that on both sides, but Trump really blurred the line on that, because Trump ended up actually being a huge supporter of Israel and moved the embassy and stuff like that. But like during his campaign, I remember at one point it wasn't clear who was a bigger Israel supporter, like him or Hillary. I mean, Hillary was pretty staunch on Israel. And so from that point onward, other issues have, but at the time, I mean, there were just weeks where I would write for my newspaper. I would write about nothing but Israel.
Right. Fascinating. Well, to be continued. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your editing and writing. I was thrilled to have my first piece in Quillette a couple weeks ago. And
and by the way, I know that. Well, okay, yeah, I know the guy, but thank you for promoting my work, including my book. But I'll take this opportunity to say that your piece, I think, is a real eye opener. It's at Quillette. People can Google your name, Google Quillette, and for those who haven't read it, sorry, I sound like a host, but I want to make sure people read it. It's a really good insight into the problems and challenges facing institutional Jewish leaders trying to navigate the social justice landscape. Because one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about, synagogue politics, certain issues, Israel, and this is going back maybe 10, 20 years, gay marriage have been always like big issues in Canadian synagogues. I went to a Reconstructionist synagogue, but even at a Reconstructionist synagogue 20 years ago, gay marriage, like, there was pushback on it. Sure. But now what your article does is it's an eye opener on how it's not just like those two issues, or it's about issues that like really have nothing directly to do with Judaism. It's like, Black Lives Matter, some gender stuff. And it's so a progressive Jewish leader, or a leader who wants to be on side on these issues, it isn't just 2 or 3 issues. They have to be on side on like 100 issues. And it was such an eye opener, because I think maybe a lot of people, including the Jewish community, think that maybe people on that level are kind of insulated from it. But as you make clear, you show us inside the sausage factory, they are not insulated from it. It was really,
they are not insulated. No, I just had coffee with a prominent conservative rabbi who's really struggling with this stuff, and I'm hearing a lot about that. Most of them don't want to go to public right now, but they're really struggling with how to navigate their own congregations, and these are challenging times.
When they go public, I know a guy. Okay, so
I'll know who to refer them to. Yeah. Okay. Sounds great. Well, thanks a million.
Okay. Talk soon. Thank you.